Part 3. Downtown Los Angeles, 4:12 a.m. 24 minutes later, in the linear progression of time as we know it, and almost 8 kilometers away, the air took on that charged quality again. It happened in a fetid alley running along behind Broadway at 7th, and the first of the alley's denizens to notice were the rats. They paused in their unceasing patrols of the trash heaps and dumpsters to sniff at the air uncertainly. They could sense something at the threshold of perception, a tension, an urgency in the air. Reluctantly, they abandoned their forages and darted for concealment, just as a faint, unearthly illumination lit the alley like moonlight on the seafloor. In a scramble to flee, one of the rodents skittered noisily across the wet cardboard under which Benjamin Shantz huddled in an alcoholic stupor. He swore and batted clumsily at it, then hugged himself and subsided back into his trackless mumbling. Through a gap between buildings, Shantz could catch a glimpse of the ethereal chrome cylinders of the Bonaventure Hotel. It seemed a vision from a utopian world and a time inconceivably far removed from his own, although the distance was less than 4 blocks. In rare moments of lucidity, Ben reflected on the pinball workings of fate that bounced him through life on a bum's rush to this urban decay purgatory, while his best high school buddy had become the CEO of a major film studio. However, this was not one of the lucid moments. In fact, the sourceless wind and the oppressive buzzing noise had been growing for some time before he noticed them at all. The purple glow intensified into a spotlight glare as the wind kicked bits of paper and pieces of things that used to be whole into the air. The buzzing became the static of a View transistor radio searching frantically for a station. The storm of papers, boxes, and refuse swirled into a blizzard. Shantz's cardboard shelter was snatched away. He cringed, squinting at the glare, covering his ears. Fingers of purple chained lightning began to dance around the wet brick walls, hissing, sputtering, seeking anything metallic, then crawling along it like a living thing. It licked the rusting fire escapes, raced up and down the drain pipes, undulating like St. Elmo's fire. The static rose in pitch to a piercing whine. Painted over windows exploded inward, showering glass into darkened buildings. A burglar alarm added its strident clamour to the din. Ben had seen some pretty weird sights, but he'd never seen anything like this before. There was an explosion of light and sound in mid-air, a strobe flash and a thunderclap, followed by a back rush of imploding air. When Kyle Reese came blasting through, he was high and off-centre, his body stabilised in this temporal continuum a good 2 meters above the ground. He hung there for a microsecond, then gravity took over and slammed him into the alley floor with a loud, flat whack. He lay there, naked and trembling, eyes shut tight against the searing light, fists clenched against his chest, knees drawn up like an overgrown fetus. Spasms racked every muscle in his body. After the explosion, the wall of sound had ceased, leaving only the rustle of papers settling back to earth. The sickening odour of singed hair filled Reese's nostrils, choking him. Pain was shooting through every fibre of his body. They didn't tell him it was going to be like this, he thought. Maybe they didn't know. But oh fuck, it hurt. He took it slow, marshalling his resources, sipping at the ozone-filled air until he could draw real breaths. The feeling of having his nuts kicked up into his chest cavity was abating. A little. He opened his eyes and saw ghostly after-images of sights that had yanked at his sanity like saltwater taffy. The sensations were fading. Memory could not hold that kind of intensity, the high chroma. What had it been like? Falling down an elevator shaft with high-tension cable tied to your balls, lighting you up like a 1,000-watt bulb, pumping napalm down your throat and lungs. Reese let the sensation of the rain running down his back help him focus. He dragged his knees under him, steadying both hands on the ground, and stayed that way, like a bent-over supplicant, until the pavement ceased its dizzying movement. He felt sharp pebbles between his palms and the asphalt. Wherever he was, it was real, solid, not like that banshee maelstrom he'd just ridden. Reese glanced up quickly and saw two eyes peering at him from a pile of cardboard debris. Shantz, his grime-blackened face and stringy beard moulding him into the substance and texture of the alley, except for the eyes which blinked uncomprehendingly. Reese saw no immediate threat from the man, recognizing him instinctively for what he was, a harmless scav. For the moment, he could be ignored. "Okay, move it, Reese," he thought to himself. "Off your ass and on your feet, soldier. Let's go." With a supreme act of will, he staggered up and reeled dizzily to a stairway railing, melting into the safety of shadows. Only minutes had passed since his arrival, he knew. Still, he cursed himself for having lain there, exposed and helpless, for so long. He scanned his surroundings. Buildings, brick or concrete, glass windows, unbroken, electric streetlight, movement at the end of the alley, passing red and white lights, automobiles, definitely pre-war. Good. He rubbed his arm unconsciously, a bloody scrape where he came down. The techs had brought him in high. With so little time to familiarize themselves with the displacement field equipment and its calibration, they must have erred on the side of safety, rather than materializing knee-deep in pavement. Right. Looking down, Reese noticed he was covered in a fine white ash, although some of it had been washed away by the rain. He brushed at it, realizing that it was carbonized residue of the conductive jelly the techs had smeared on him. He had questioned nothing. They said strip, he stripped. You're going alone, they said. Fine. No weapons? No. Shit. Metals won't displace. Fuck it. Okay, he wasn't a tech, just a soldier. He wished he could have brought something, though. His fingers unconsciously clenched the remembered shape of the stock of his Westinghouse M25 plasma rifle. He glanced upward. Nothing but sky above the tall buildings. No hunter-killers, of course. Not in pre-war. But to look was a reflex that had saved him more than once. Didn't they have something like Mark 7 aerials, though? Helicopters. Yeah, I think. But he wasn't sure. History was a blur to him. What was invented when? Who could keep it straight? Pre-war was a jigsaw puzzle, spilled on the floor, and he'd lived his whole life among the pieces. The charred pieces. He realized with a start how stunned he must be to have stood daydreaming in one spot for so many seconds. He forced himself to think clearly, strategically. First, clothing, for warmth and camouflage. Second, weapons. Third, say, buddy. The words were a slurred croak, but Reese turned, remembering the old scav. Hell of a shitstorm here a minute ago, Shantz ventured. Reese identified the words as English, probably American, though the inflections were unfamiliar. Good news. He sprinted to where the derelict lay, sprawled in a doorway. Get your clothes off, Reese said, already tugging at the old man's jacket. What? Just do it, Reese hissed. Now. He drew back a fist to expedite cooperation, but the old man caught the intensity in Reese's voice and began to comply. Don't hit me, Shantz mewed, slumping back into a stupor as his grimy fingers fumbled futilely with the unassailable complexity of his zipper. Reese pulled the filthy trousers rapidly off Shantz's spindly legs. They smelled. Urine and caked-on grime. Reese barely noticed and didn't care. To Shantz, Reese was a figure going in and out of focus. He seemed to be a young man, maybe 20, 25, but there was something about him that was older. The eyes, yeah, old man's eyes. Seen too much. Said a particularly cogent Shantz mind bubble. Like me. But not exactly like Shantz. Something in Reese's gaze sent a chill into the old man's belly. He kept quiet and hoped he would live. Reese had the trousers on and was reaching for the jacket when he felt, at the edge of his consciousness, trouble. His senses had been fine-tuned by years of hunkering down, listening, waiting, and watching. sipping at all the little sights and sounds that tell you death is in the neighbourhood, hoping to drop by and smother you with a cold, wet kiss goodbye. Reese pivoted and crouched, eyes instinctively focused on the street at the alley's end. A brilliant white light stabbed towards him, sweeping across the walls, then caught him in its beam like an insect. For a microsecond, Reese stared intently into it, through it, past it, to its source. A black and white LAPD cruiser, searchlight mounted on the window frame, 2 men sitting inside. Reese knew instantly what they were. Police. Hostiles. If he'd had more time, he would have cursed himself again for his slowness. Where he came from, he'd be dead already. Reese was on automatic now, decisions coming in instant flashes. He needed what they had, transportation, weapons, radio. But they would be armed, and he was not. There was no question of a fight. Evacuate. He twisted away from the beam and dissolved into the shadows. Evac, evac. The words echoed urgently inside Reese's head. How many times had he heard them before? 1,000, maybe? In how many voices? And as you shouldered the wounded and turned to run, the words were always followed by other sounds behind you, closing in for the kill sounds. This time he heard the chirp of tires as the black and white cruiser came to a halt. Reese was halfway to the other end of the alley before the sound faded and died. Sergeant Michael Niedeffer futilely swept the searchlight around the alley, trying to spot the young man he had pinned only a second before. God, that kid's fast, he thought. He's rabbiting, Niedeffer said. Take the car around. The alley comes out on 7th. His rookie partner, Lewis, nodded and threw the black and white cruiser into reverse. As Niedeffer jumped out, drawing his .38, the cruiser was already tearing away, siren blasting, throwing out a red and blue light show. Niedeffer caught sight of Reese flashing through a patch of light, heading towards a junction, where the alley intersected with another. He took a deep breath and ran after him. Reese had heard the cruiser race away and the single pair of footsteps behind him, and he knew what they had done. He had gotten lucky. Only one of them was behind him. One was better. He could take out the one and have a weapon. He concentrated on that single goal, ignoring everything else. Broken glass was scattered all along the floor. He felt pain as some of it cut at his bare feet. Reese pushed the pain back, away from his consciousness. The effort helped him clear his head. A pile of tumbled garbage cans loomed up, blocking his path. Reese cleared them and ran on without slowing. A hot-wired rat in an urban maze. Reese whipped around a corner and disappeared. Niedeffer instinctively slowed his pace. 15 years of bad coffee, Taco Bell and cigarettes made his lungs wheeze. But that wasn't why he had slowed now. Fear made that decision. Niedeffer muttered a curse. He had let him get out of sight. Now it would be more dangerous. Son of a bitch. Inside his stomach, condors were flying around. They don't pay you enough for this. No way. He cocked the hammer of his revolver, stepped to the center of the alley, and slowly walked to the intersection. Niedeffer peered down the side alley, one hand holding the gun before him like a shield, the other hand unconsciously covering his belly. He saw no one. Carefully, he made his way down the near black corridor, pausing as he came abreast of 2 large Dempsey dumpsters. They were spilling over with flattened cardboard and wooden boxes. No room in there. But there was space between them. Enough space for a man. Niedeffer put both hands back on his weapon and raised it to chest level. He peered into the gap intently. Nothing. Just some wooden slats thrown haphazardly away. But Reese was there, waiting. Niedeffer was staring right at him, but saw nothing, just the wall and the boards. Reese was staring at Niedeffer's revolver, the way a starving man stares at food. It was an old design, but in mint condition. Probably new, and Reese recognized it immediately. Smith & Wesson Police Special, caliber .38 Super. He had actually fired one several times. The kick was light, and it was accurate. It wasn't a serious gun like a .44 mag, but he'd had to use worse weapons before. Then Reese turned his attention to the man in front of him. He was middle-aged, paunchy, short of breath, and he was scared. Reese couldn't have asked for more. He came flying out of the darkness like a high-speed whisper, with the full weight of every solid ounce of matter in his being focused into a point at the tip of his shoulder. He aimed that point at the center of Nideffer's back and slammed into him like a freight train. Reese's right hand grabbed onto the wrist holding the revolver, and as Nideffer started to go down, there was a deafening concussion and glare from the muzzle flash. Twisting fiercely, Reese pulled the weapon free. With his other hand, he controlled his roll and came up on both feet. Pulling the stunned officer up and slamming him against the alley wall, Reese stepped back, raised the weapon, cocked the hammer, and aimed it directly into the officer's face. Nideffer stared past the barrel of his service revolver into the eyes of the oldest kid he'd ever seen. The eyes were flat too. Not really angry, just intense. Spooky. Reese had 1,000 questions that needed answering. His exact location, the location of the target, the number and condition of vehicles in the area. Endless. He saw Los Angeles Police Department written on Nideffer's badge, and he knew he was in the right city. But there was one question whose answer could render all others as irrelevant, and Reese knew he had very little time before the other police officer would come screeching around the end of the alley. "What time is it?" Reese barked. "About 4:30 a.m. "What day?" "Friday," Nideffer answered, hoping it would somehow calm the lunatic down. It didn't. Impatiently, Reese snapped at him. "The date!" Nideffer was a little unsure. He stammered, the 9th, March 9th. Reese glared at him viciously and asked the million-dollar question. "What year?" Nideffer felt blind terror crawling up from the center of his belly and clawing away at the edges of his brain. He wants to know what year it is? This is all I'll ever see, he thought. This insane kid's face. God damn it. Nideffer closed his eyes and waited for the bullet. The howl of brakes on wet pavement echoed across the walls of the buildings. Reese turned and saw the flashing blue and red lights of the cruiser as it came to a halt at the mouth of the alley. Lewis jumped out, his weapon drawn. Reese spun around and began to race towards the street exit at the opposite end when he saw another flashing cruiser roll up in front of him. He was flanked, cut off, sealed. Reese scanned the terrain with lightning-fast precision. The padlocked steel door was just a few meters away. He lunged for it, focusing himself like a battering ram, intent on the point just beyond the lock. The force of the impact almost knocked the air out of him, but the door gave way and beckoned into the darkness beyond. His eyes strained to adjust to the new darkness. Beneath his bare feet, he felt the smooth, cold surface of a tiled floor. He bolted forward, twisting, turning, crashing through the maze-like hallway, bouncing off stacks of high boxes until, ahead, there was the horizontal crack of a dim light that meant a doorway. He hit it at top speed, punching it open. He was in a vast shadow and light-streaked room, running through a gridwork of open channels between islands of tables and shelves. He was trying to get a fix on the terrain, willing his irises to open up and work. The air smelled familiar, antiseptic, filtered, like the air he had breathed in the subsurface bunkers a second before his sapper team put the torch to them. He didn't like that smell at all. His ears picked up the distant, amorphous hum of air-conditioning ducts cycling atmosphere through the building, and then, behind him, near the door he had come through, the unmistakable sharp echo of pounding feet that told him he was no longer alone in the dark interior. Reese kept going, faster, nearly flying through the black space surrounding him, navigating, on instinct, the sound of his own movements bouncing back to him. Then his vision came online. Stretching before Reese were rows and rows of fantastic treasure. Clothes, furniture, tools. Even half seen in the darkness, it was incredible. A gluttonous hoard of sparkling, multicolored merchandise. He was in a department store. Reese flashed off the aisle into the shadow of a rack of long coats, held his breath, and put out the radar. Above the thunderous roar of blood crashing through his ears, he locked onto the sound of the threat force. 3 of them, separated, moving towards him in a loose sweep. By quadrants, Reese scanned the room, hunting for an evac route. The northwest wall was plate glass, intact, facing the street. Beyond it, a black and white police cruiser slowly prowled past, then was gone. Camouflage. Silently, Reese reached up into the rack above him and pulled one of the raincoats free, slipping it on, realizing only then that he had been cold. The footsteps were slowly converging towards him. The flicking finger of a probing flashlight hit the tiled floor on the next aisle. Move, move, move. As silent as a wisp of smoke, Reese left the shadow of the rack and ran low, like a crab, along the edge of the aisle towards the plate glass window. A display of well-dressed mannequins filled it, staring emptily into the street. Reese moved among them, scooping out the window, hunting for an exit. He looked up. A paper banner hung above the display. The look for 84. Perfect. He was right on target. Suddenly, the searing arc of police cruisers' searchlights swept through the glass. Reese froze. No good, Reese thought, and backed away towards the centre of the building. He could hear muffled voices and the careful padding of feet all around him now. He was halfway past a table of leather and canvas shoes before he slid to a halt. Scan. Movement? Nothing. Empty. Where are you fuckers? He wondered. Silence. Good, Reese thought, and grabbed a pair of shoes from the aisle, slapping them against the sole of his foot. Too small. Another pair. Very close. Good enough. Reese hurtled down the aisle. Ahead, more flashlights darted in approach. He'd reconned the immediate area. Where to go? A metal booth, its curtain drawn open, squatted in the darkness a few meters away. The words, "Passport photo," were painted on the side. Reese ducked inside, pulled the curtain shut, perched himself on a little stool, and quickly slipped into the shoes. Every foot soldier since the dawn of history has known that a good pair of boots is as critical to survival as the best of weapons. Reese laced the shoes and tested their feel. They seemed light and insubstantial, with a thin sole which would be bad for broken terrain, but they were well made and fit passably. The words Nike were stitched on the side, a type of obsolete ballistic missile, he knew. Beneath the curtain, a finger of light dashed in, probed around, then retreated. There was a pause. More muttering. Reese tensed. Then, slowly, the voices faded. Reese released his breath and quietly slipped out of the booth. An escalator sat impassively in the darkness. It had been shut off hours earlier, reducing it to a mere flight of metal stairs. Reese took the steps 2 at a time, flying up them to the second floor. Housewares. And ladies' lingerie. On the southwest wall, Reese found what he was hunting for, a fire escape exit. The smooth metal door was closed. A wire ran down the length of its edge, forming a crude alarm circuit, and a sign, painted on a bar spanning the door's width, that warned that it was to be used only in case of an emergency. No shit. Reese punched the bar, and the door flew open. There was no sound. The alarm must be silent, or burned out by time displacement overload. He perched quietly on the open grill of the fire escape, and scanned the alley beneath him. A black and white LAPD cruiser was parked directly below, lights flashing. Empty. Reese dropped to the asphalt like a cat and crouched beside the vehicle's door. Empty street. Activity around the corner. He tried the door. Unlocked. Amazing. They must have been in a hell of a hurry, Reese thought. He opened it and reached into the ignition. No keys. He needed transportation. He thought of hot-wiring the car. Fuck it, too conspicuous. He dismissed the vehicle itself and focused on what lay inside. Sitting in its mount, leaning against the dash, was a factory-fresh Remington 870 pump shotgun. Reese was in awe. He had seen and carried several of these weapons, but they were battered museum pieces. This one, like most of the wonders around him, looked new. He lifted it free and into the safety of his raincoat. Holding it there, under his arm, it could not be seen. It would not get wet. It would be his friend. Then Reese spun around and stepped quickly away from the car. After rounding the street corner, he strolled unhurriedly down the sidewalk. 3.5 minutes ago, he'd been as naked as a newborn infant. Now he was armed, clothed, and blending into the population. He would need money and supplies and transportation, but there was plenty of time for that. God damn it, he was here. He made it. A surge of adrenaline passed through him. Reese was almost giddy with the intense pleasure of being alive, pulling it off. He looked up, blinking against the rain falling into his eyes, and scanned the miraculous landscape that surrounded him. He was standing on the corner of 6th and Olive. Across the street was Pershing Square. He realized he'd been born less than a mile away. He'd even played here when he was a kid, but it never looked like this. Buildings, 5 and 6 stories high, surrounded the small park. And the light. Everywhere light poured down on him. Reese hovered in the shadow of a doorway, awestruck by the amazing scene before him. How long ago was it, Reese wondered, just minutes from his point of view, when he was running down that steel corridor with the rest of his sapper squad. Deafening explosions echoed behind them, tearing the corridor and its equipment apart. His people were zapping the place, torching it, killing it. The sense of victory was humming like electric current through the team members. And then this. It didn't seem to bother John. Nothing did. That was part of what made him who he was. He ran alongside Reese, his hand reassuringly gripping the young man's shoulder, shouting terse instructions into his ear. It was John's decision that Reese should be the one. Then he was standing with a group of techs who were making last-minute calibrations on a vast array of equipment. Reese rapidly stripped off his uniform and handed his pulse rifle to one of his teammates. The techs poured over him like ants, taking bio readings, pumping chemicals into his system. John stepped back, quietly fixing his eyes on Reese. Things were happening really fast now. The tech sprayed him down from head to toe with a thick, bluish superconducting jelly. Its foul smell choked Reese. Then the techs led him into a small chamber and backed away. Reese and John locked eyes. There was something unusual in John's face. An expression that Reese had only seen once, a few years before, when John pulled him from the 132nd and placed him in his personal recon security team. Reese gazed back into the staring faces of the people before him. His people. Then there was a horrible, unending flash of light and pain. And then the alley floor. Now Reese, in the rain, gazing at Pershing Square, never felt so lonely in his life, or so exhilarated. This place. It was the same place, but so vastly different. He knew it would look like this, but he didn't know it would be like this. Don't think, his mind commanded. Do not feel this place. Reese shut it all out, put it in a tiny room, and bolted the door. The mission was everything. The mission was all that mattered. Reese walked directly to a telephone booth 1.5 blocks away and lifted the heavy directory to the narrow metal shelf. He opened it to the C's and began scanning the pages. Seconds later, his fingers stopped beside a name. Sarah J. Connor.